the trees that we climbed as a child. And trees I think, are extra important for our relationships with plants because they're more our scale. Trees are often our size, and we've climbed in them, and we know them as individual beings with individual histories. And trees are just such a great way for people to connect with plants and think about how important individual plants and individual species are, rather than thinking about plants as this green curtain that just exists out there. I got into the botany part of archaeobotany because when I arrived at the research laboratory where I had a graduate fellowship in archaeology, and Brian was looking at ceramics, and Rex was looking at bones, and other people were looking at lithics. And what was left, plants were the leftover category that nobody else had claimed. And because my father is a plant physiologist, at the University of Kentucky, now retired, I knew a little bit about plants, or at least I had the confidence to think I could learn, and I just raised my hand and said, sure, I'll do that, with no idea that it was the subdiscipline with the highest learning curve, the most need for knowledge across the board. But it's worked out, I think, and it's never, ever been boring, because there are so many ways that plants are important, and ways that we can explore uses of plants, whether it's through anthropology, whether it's through history, whether it's through archaeology, whether it's through chemistry. The possibilities are infinite. My day-to-day work mostly involves microscope work, looking for remains of plants from archaeological sites that people have used in the past. And in temperate climates, like most of Texas, as you know, most plant material, when left in the ground, becomes compost. It's simply not available to us, except perhaps chemically. And we are fortunate that a lot of plants become preserved through carbonization. You know, when you make a campfire and you have little bits of wood charcoal are left over the next morning, if you have spat plum pits or grape seeds into that fire, those also can become carbonized, and that charcoal will preserve for centuries, millennia, tens of millennia. And that's what I'm looking for under the microscope. And as I'm sure you know, wild seeds are very small. If you've ever gotten a raspberry seed or a blueberry seed caught in your teeth, these are very small, so they're not something that archaeologists typically find during excavation. You have to do special water processing, and then you dry it out. And then I'm with the microscope looking at these pieces of burned plants. And a lot of the archaeology that I'm involved with are excavations that are done by sometimes by universities, but more often regulatory archaeology that's done, say, in advance of road projects. Just like you need to go look for endangered salamanders before you put a road through someplace, you need to look for an ancient Indian village, and then decide, do you want to pay archaeologists to excavate through that village, or are you going to move the road around it? And that's how the archaeology that I'm involved with is often done. It also means that, so I'm involved in communities of archaeologists, but also communities of the descendants of people in those communities, which in East Texas means Caddo Indians. Caddo ancestors are the people who've lived there for at least the last couple of millennia, and of course Apaches, Comanches, all kinds of folks all across Texas and elsewhere, and Tapilam Mission Indians in the San Antonio area, and that's been a real joy to be involved in those communities and sharing plant knowledge, which definitely goes both directions. Me learning about traditional plant practices, and being able to share things that I've found. For Caddo, one thing that the archaeology I do at the microscope has made me very aware of are the extent to which Caddo ancestors used wild legumes, wild beans, because there's a couple of centuries of gap between the time that Caddo ancestors started using corn as a dietary staple and the time they started growing common beans. And to make a complete protein out of your grass, you need a grass legume combination. Like in the case of modern people, often bread and peanut butter is your grain legume combination. So corn and wild beans is what Caddo ancestors used to create these complementary proteins in their diet prior to importing common beans from the southwestern U.S. So I think that's been a really interesting find. Every single archaeological project is its own unique thing. It's divided into, we divide it into archaeological features, and then within the features I divide that into wood charcoal, and here's my prickly pear seed, and here's whatever else it is. And so I'm doing kind of botany and taxonomy, that any project is made up of teeny tiny little silos that you group together. And I think atomizing projects like that, even in marketing and economics, it's something you have to do to break a project down into pieces in order to accomplish it, in order to conceptualize it. But it's also important to put things back together, to integrate them. Often plant discoveries aren't a single plant, like a golden idol with ruby eyes or something that people talk about, the artifact that made their career. That's pretty rare with a plant. Although I did recover a prickly pear seed from the north side of Indianapolis, and there is a species of prickly pear that grows up there, but it doesn't seem to have been much used by peoples in the region. And so that was a fun find, I have to say, when you find a plant out of place, or a fragment of bodark wood in Menard County, Texas, 400 miles away from what were probably the nearest stands of bodark at that time. So evidence for an ancient trade in bodark that certainly reached central Texas. So those were interesting individual finds, but often it's more in the patterns of what was used when and where, as I talked a little bit about the wild beans that were used as complementary proteins, that really speaks to the creativity and knowledge of ancient and modern indigenous people. And other archaeobotanists who have made really interesting discoveries. For instance, Elizabeth Horton, working up in the Ozark Plateau, has documented the use of Eryngium yuccifolium, which is called rattlesnake master in English, as a fiber plant. And that was not a much known fiber plant in historic times, but was widely used earlier in antiquity. And similarly, there is what they're calling a burrito from High Rolls Cave in New Mexico. That's a yucca pod that was filled with sort of a corn masa, and also, I believe, amaranth and chenopodium and some herbs. So this isn't just it's not just an interesting archaeobotanical find, it's a demonstration of an item of cuisine that simply didn't exist in the historic period. So there are whole millennia of traditional cuisines that we're just now starting to learn about. And those are things that they're interesting historically, but they also point to possible future directions that we can take food and healthy food for the planet. I think if I could sit in a room with other people whose work and perspectives would be interesting and useful and productive for what I do, for the research I do in plants of the past, I would have, well, indigenous people, obviously, and perspectives on their ancestors. But I think also urban farmers are really interesting right now, both for the future of farming and for the future of bringing plant foods and other foods to people in urban areas as we continue to become an increasingly urban society. Urban farmers are really interesting because they're producing food on small holdings in close contact with people, so they have a lot in close proximity to people. So they have a lot of the issues about they have solved a lot of the problems of how to get rid of, or maybe not generate, agricultural waste. See, this is why I need to talk to urban farmers and find out more about it. I think I'm going to need to start this over because I don't have my urban farmer thing down. Okay. They're small holders, so they know how to do farming sustainably in proximity to people. And there was something else tickling the back of my mind about why urban farmers are so important. Oh, and they're analogs for the past. There we go. Okay, I will start again. If I could sit in a room with a group of people whose work and perspectives would be really helpful, really amplify the kinds of work that I do studying ancient uses of plants and ancient perspectives on plants. Obviously, I'd have indigenous descendants and the perspectives that they bring and the knowledge they bring about plant use and their ancestors and current attitudes toward plants. But I would also really want urban farmers in the room because, well, first of all, I think in a lot of ways urban farmers are an important part in the future of agriculture and in important parts in the future of food chains, in having food produced in close proximity to these large population centers that we increasingly are. And they've also solved a lot of the problems of how do you produce food when you're near people? How do you not be a nuisance? How do you not have farm waste running off your land and into the rivers and so on? Because you simply can't do that in urban areas. So they've solved a lot of problems. They're growing interesting and diverse crops in small spaces. And that's also an analog. It's not just the future of farming, it's an analog to the kinds of things I'm interested in about farming practices in the past, where smallholders, intense farming in proximity to urban spaces, and you see that all over the world, in the Maya region in China, probably in the eastern woodlands, certainly in the Pueblo Southwest. So I think that would be a really important element in what I would see as what I would look toward as things that could be helpful to me. And it's one of the many disciplines that need to be in the mix when we're talking about the past and the future of plants and people. We need to conserve it. I think we need to conserve in all the ways possible, in order to have redundancy built in the system, because we don't know when things are going to fail. So, and here I guess I should mention diversity and resilience as we're facing multiple challenges in terms of climate and the future and population trends and urbanization, and we could go on and on and on with all the challenges we're facing. But I think we know that diversity leads to resilience, and preserving the diversity of plants, preserving and conserving the diversity of plants is a really good idea. I can't guarantee it will be critical, but I expect it's just a really good idea for our future to conserve the knowledge about plants and how they were used in the past and how they can be used in the future. The genetics of plants, sort of ex situ conservation, and to preserve the plants themselves in their niches on the land so that we have access to those things in the future, partly for needs other than agriculture, but maybe most critically for agriculture, and what kinds of crops we might need in the future that we just don't know about right now because we don't know exactly what those conditions will be. And if I can bring that back to archaeology for a minute, Chenopodium quinoa is the South American crop is the South American plant that our crop quinoa is based on, and it grows best at altitude. And it's I think much less well known that indigenous North Americans domesticated Chenopodium berlandieri. We had an American quinoa that was domesticated, had the thin seed coats. If you look at the wild plants now, they have those thick black seed coats, but the ancient domestic form had the thin seed coats that you see, the clear seed coats that you see on Chenopodium quinoa. And the possibility of redomesticating Chenopodium berlandieri exists, and that's something that archaeology can contribute to the dialogue moving forward about what kinds of crops might be possible or wise for the future. And to me, the reason that useful wild plants is important is because it's positioned at the intersection of so many interesting things. It's both a repository of knowledge about how and why plants have been useful in the past, and it's also a vision of conservation for plants on the land and the knowledge so that plants can be useful to us in the future. It's very much holistic, and I think as we look toward the future, you're going to have to cut this because I don't know where I'm going with that. One thing that the pandemic has shown us, I think, really is how fragile our supply chains are. Things that we are used to having come into our stores and into our houses without even thinking about may suddenly not. And we have to be prepared to be resilient in a lot of dimensions in the future. And our increased knowledge of plants, plant research, for the future of plants, and increasing the knowledge of plants and conserving the knowledge about plants in the past are going to be absolutely critical to a resilient future for humanity. There's an archaeologist whose name I can't remember right now. There's an archaeologist who points out that the trouble with time is that it only runs in one direction. And that means we don't know what the future's going to be. I think we can all come up with instances of somebody who said with confidence that this is what's going to happen, and it doesn't. Which is all a long and roundabout way of saying we ignore any plant at our peril because we don't know what we're going to need. So I think we need to continue with everything we can. Redundancy, resilience, it's all going to matter in the long run. Any plant could matter, and any plant should. To say, I think it's pretty naive to think that if anything was important, anything important has already been invented or found or discovered. It's a pretty limited understanding of history. And I think it's partly too that we have different needs in different times and places. And where we are now is always a unique space. And what our needs now are always unique in space and time. So what has happened before is important and can be useful, but it's never a perfect analogy, and we never know what other thing we might need to add in the mix. I think that's why we can never say, well, if it was important, it would have been done already. I think that's we have to be more creative than that. We have to be more humble than that. We have to know that we don't and can't know what the future's going to bring. We just have to be ready for it. I think maybe almost using the term plant science implies a certain type of expertise that certainly I like to think I bring a little of that, and I know people who do, but the future of plants is more than something, is so wide, holistic, interdisciplinary, I think we might say. It's everybody. Everybody can contribute to a vision of conserving and using plants for the future, and that includes gardeners and chefs, anybody who uses plants, whittlers, people who do woodworking. All of it, all of it's important. All of this knowledge is important, and all of it's useful. Even I think folks whose knowledge is in their hands, and maybe don't write it down, wouldn't consider writing it down, but it's really, really important and needs to be conserved just as much as the genetics and the history books. I have had a formal intern in my office. Learning the trade that I do with the microscope, and certainly that person is a graduate student at Texas A&M, and will very likely go on as a professional with a PhD. But that's not the only way, and it's not necessarily even the most important way to contribute to plant conservation and plant knowledge. A lot of these traditions are in people's stories, or they're in people's hands, and honestly in people's hearts, in terms of the perspective you bring to plants and the respect that you bring for the plants out in the world.